I want to begin with a trilemma. Now, you've heard the term dilemma. A dilemma is when you have two things and you can't do them both. They both cannot really exist. So it's kind of like if you're young and before you're married, you have two girls you're in love with. You can only date one. If you want to date them both, you got a dilemma because you got to choose one or the other. Well, a trilemma, maybe I've talked about this before, is when you have three things and they cannot really exist, not at first blush. The trilemma theologically is this: God is love, but God's all powerful, but you've got the presence of evil and suffering. So how? How can God be all loving? Or how can God be all powerful? Because if he's all loving and all powerful, he would eradicate anything that's suffering, anything that's evil and justice. And yet, here we have it. So that must mean either God's not all loving. If he is all powerful, then he means evil to happen. Or he's all loving, but he's not all powerful, so he feels badly that bad things happen. But the Bible says, no, God's all loving. And everything God does, he does out of his love for us. But sometimes his love for us doesn't feel very loving. And the Bible says that God is all powerful. All things work together for good under his power. And yet sometimes it seems like God's not exercising much power to try to protect me from the pain and suffering, evil in my life. And so the issue really is not, is God all love or all powerful? There's another element, and it wipes out the trilemma. And what the element is God's wisdom. See, we rest in God's love because he says he loves us, even when it doesn't feel like we're being loved. And we rest in God's power, even though at times we're not so sure we recognize it. So we rest in his love, we rest in his power, but we trust in his wisdom. Because his wisdom is when he's choosing to love us the way he's loving us, when he chooses to exercise his power the way he chooses to exercise his power. So we rest in his love, we rest in his power, but we must trust in his wisdom. And the expression of trusting in his wisdom, that's why in James 1:5 says when you're smacked on the side of the head by the pain of this world, he says, ask God, not for more love and more power, but you ask God for what? Wisdom. And wisdom is to understand what Solomon's going to talk about today, that God has a plan. That in God's wisdom, he has a plan for your life. When I was younger in faith, I remember that Bill Bright and Campus Saved for Christ came out with a little tool. Some of you might remember this, the 4 spiritual laws. And we were trained to use the 4 spiritual laws. We went to people on the beach all over the place. Sometimes we were rude, but we'd share the 4 spiritual laws. And it would begin with basically that God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life. And the God loving you was not a difficult thing, but this has a wonderful plan for your life. Isn't it really possible that God actually has a plan, a wonderful plan for my life? Because there's so many things in my life that makes no sense. There's things that have come into my life, have gone out of my life. There's been times this world has beat up on me. There's other times I've had some great fun, but these all seem to be disconnected. They all seem to be absurdly alienated from each other. And so I've got all this senselessness in my life. And is it possible that somehow that all of those are pieces that fit together into a plan that God has for my life? Now, if there is some plan for my life, do I have any say in it? Do I get to influence this plan that he has for my life? Or is it some kind of fatalistic, predetermined course? Whether I like it or not, God has a plan. It's in cement. It's going to happen. I can't influence or do anything about it. And then why should I even care? All right, God has a plan for my life. Who cares if God has a plan for my life? Well, I guess I care. I'd like to know, is this plan moving towards something good? Or is it moving towards something bad? I'd like to know how this thing's going to turn out. Is my life going to turn out to be a tragedy that people share with tears? Or is my life going to end up being that something is going to be good coming out of the footprint that I left on this planet while I was alive? I know Jeremiah 29:11 says, "For I know the plans that I have for you, for welfare and a future hope." But of course, that was a promise made specifically through Jeremiah to the children of Israel. So it's not really a promise to me, but Philippians 1:6 is. When Paul says, "I'm confident of this very thing, that God, who began a good work in you, will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ." Then he comes back in chapter 2 of Philippians. And he says, "Don't you know it is God God in you, who both to will and to do his good pleasure." You could put the word pleasure, his good plan. Or you could go to Romans 8:28 and 29. That's written to me as a Christian. "For God works all things together for good," not to everybody, "to those who love God and are called according to his purpose." What's another word for purpose? Plan. So there does seem to be that sometimes things seem so senseless, and it would be wonderful for me to believe that there is a wonderful plan for my life, and all these pieces of things that happen in my life all fit together and make sense. Well, that's what we have here in chapter 3 of Solomon's personal journal. So if you haven't already, open your Bibles to Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And this is a poem. Very interesting poem. This is one of the better known passages of the Bible to the whole world, around the globe, more because of this poem. And part of that happened in 1965 by a guy named Pete Seeger. And Pete Seeger wrote a song that was made famous in 1965 by the Byrds. Any of you old enough to remember "Turn, Turn, Turn"? That whole song was based on this poem. But what's also interesting is this poem is considered one of the finest pieces of literature that's ever been written. It is actually studied under the theme and category of poetry in many, many universities today. One Hebrew scholar called this poem the very heart of the whole book. So chapter 3 begins a new section. Remember, the first two sections, chapters 1 and 2, had to do with him introducing his journal by saying, "Hey, you want to know what the gift is? It's life itself. And you're only going to live life in the moment, because whether you become really, really wealthy, but all the pleasures you can buy, they're over so quickly. And then you have an aftertaste." Remember, he says, what's a yatron? The yatron is basically the part that makes this fun event add to an enjoyable life. Because I can have all kinds of events in my life, like I shared with you before. If it's a hot day and I'm really thirsty, and a Diet Coke will quench my thirst, but then I'm stuck with this aftertaste, which I personally do not like. So every event has an aftertaste. So some events are fun. Hebrews even says there's pleasure in sin for a season, but there's an aftertaste. But there's other events that I can do in my life that not only is it fun and pleasurable, but the aftertaste is wonderful. Instead of guilt and shame and the memory of pain and ridicule and mockery that I created out of this stupid, foolish thing that I've done. But there's things I can do that the yatron, the aftertaste, the aftermath, leaves me with wonderful memories. Memories that stay with me for a long, long time. And when I begin to accumulate these different wise events in my life, and they all have these wonderful aftertastes, all of a sudden the aftertaste blends together into just memories that just feed you constantly, and you have a wonderful life. You enjoy your life because you've got great memories, because you've been wise with what you've done. But remember, he told us it's happiness is not just getting rich so you can buy a lot of pleasures, because if you're not wise, they're over so fast. And you don't know about the aftertaste. And it's not so smart to get real smarter. Well, if I'm smarter, then I'll be happier. But remember what he said? All that does is greater wisdom create pain. Because the smarter you become, you know how things ought to be. You know how people ought to behave. And things are not the way they ought to be, and people don't behave the way they ought to behave, and you're left with that added frustration and pain. So the idea of, well, I could be happier if I was wealthier. No, those things pass so quickly. Well, I could be happier if I was smarter. No, because you'll be just more frustrated with what you'll see, that you cannot change the human condition, no matter what you do. And you'll just continue to accumulate disappointments. So, how do you extract the enjoyment of life? Remember, he says, you're never going to live in the future. You're never going to live in the past. So don't let the future or the past distract you from being in the moment. So if you're hugging your kid, spend a little more time hugging. If you're having a wonderful time with your family, spend a little more time. And don't be thinking about the chicken, the turkey, you focus on what's in front of you, because it's only that moment, that window, you can extract the enjoyment. And when you're enjoying it, remember how we enjoy it? One, when I acknowledge, this is what Paul said in 1 Thessalonians 4, when I acknowledge it's given to me by the hand of God. So I'm spending some time with my family. I realize this now, I got to hang out with the grandkids. No, this is a gift from the hand of God. It is a blessing from God, because the Word of God says so, and I can ask God's blessing. Remember what he said? All things are wonderful and created to be enjoyed if we do three things. One, gratefulness. We acknowledge it's from the hand of God. Two, sanctified by the Word of God. This is something God says would be a blessing. My family, telling the truth, enjoying, giving out to someone, serving somebody else. It's something that God says would be a blessing. And number three, prayer, meaning I can ask God's blessing for it. When I do those three things, with everything that comes in my life, I slow time down, and I'm focusing on what's in front of me, and God chilots me. Remember, he gives me teeth to chew the steak. That was a gift, so that the steak doesn't become a curse, because my teeth had all fallen out. Remember, there's two aspects to every gift. It's the gift itself, and then the capacity to extract enjoyment from the gift. So that's what he shared with us in the first two chapters. Now he's going to come to this second section, and this is going to be the next three chapters. And the next three chapters of his journal has to do with God has a plan, and you need to understand how this works. All the little pieces in your life, all these different things that come into your life, good, bad, indifferent, they all fit into a plan. And he summarizes this plan in verse 1 of chapter 3. Solomon says, there is an appointed time for everything, and there is a time for every event under heaven. So he gives this summary statement. Here's a literal Hebrew rendering. To all a set time, and a time for every purpose under heaven. Have you ever heard the phrase or the word providence of God? This is it. Providence of God. Providence of God is that God is engaged with every detail of your life. And every particle, every event, everything that happens to you, whether it's pleasurable or painful, God says there's a purpose behind it. It's a piece of the puzzle that will fit together, that will formulate this final plan that he's got for your life. This is all about that God's engaged. That's what it means. You have a heavenly Father. So I said a couple Sundays ago, you have a heavenly, who am I? Everybody wants to define me as all kinds of things. No, I'm a son of God with a heavenly Father who's engaged with every detail of my life. There's a plan. Now he says there's this time. The word is zeman in the Hebrew, and it speaks of a season. Specific points in time when things happen to you. These events that happen to you, that's what he means by there's a time. And behind every one of these events, he says there's a purpose. The Hebrew word purpose means a delight, a pleasure, a good reason behind anything that comes into your life. That's why in Psalm 37:23 says the steps of a man are established by the Lord. He delights in his way. You remember in Psalm 139 that here God gives David this remarkable memory. He remembers in his mother's womb. Wonderful and fearfully am I made, created in the womb of my mother. And then remember, he makes the statement, and the days ordained for me were already established when as yet there was one. And we've always taken that as the length of the number of days in your life. So in your mother's womb, it was already established, ordained by God, how long you're going to live. You're not going to die a day before. You're not going to die a day later. So don't even worry about it. But it's more than just the number of days. It's the days themselves. He says the days, when you're in your mother's womb, your days were ordained by God. Every day there's a purpose behind all the events that happened in that particular day for you. So now he's going to illustrate this point, this plan, with a poem. And here's the poem. Verse 2. A time to give birth and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to throw stones and a time to gather stones. A time to embrace and a time to shun embracing. A time to search and a time to give up as lost. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear apart and a time to sew together. A time to be silent and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. Now what he does here is very, very interesting. These are 7 verses with 7 pairs. This is what Hebrews do with Hebrew poetry. We usually think of poetry in the sense of something rhyming. Roses are red, violets are blue. Most poems rhyme and some don't. Basically, right away, that wiped out that poem because it's supposed to rhyme. But not with Hebrew poetry. It's the arrangements, the artistic arrangements of the words. So you got 7 verses, so you got 7 pairs. And 7 pairs are doubled because there's 2 in each of the verses. And so you've got, what is the word 7 in the Hebrew thinking? It's God's number of completion. It's the perfect completed number. And then when you double it, it intensifies it. If a place is really, really holy, you call it the Holy of Holies. They have those superlatives. Good, better, best. That's not in the Hebrew language. If somebody is the head dog Lord, the better way to call him is what? The Lord of Lords. And so here you've got this arrangement of this poem done with completion and intensified by doubled. And what he's basically doing here is he takes a cut of life. It's like what they do sometimes. They'll take a mountain and they call it a tell in Palestine for archaeological work, and they'll slice it. They'll slice it so they can see the different layers of the history of that particular city or civilization. Well, here he basically cuts away a section of life, and he gives us a cross section of basically life for most of us. And the point is that every kind of activity in my life, there's a time for it. And in wisdom, I need to figure out what time is it. So when something comes in my life, it's different than I see it as some dislocated, out of control, horrible thing, or is it another piece of the puzzle that God is putting into the picture of the plan that one day is going to make sense to me? The poem begins with life and death, which lie beyond human control. But then he says in verse 2, a time to give birth and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted. You see, the man who has learned the secret of enjoying life as a gift from the hand of God, he's not even that concerned about how long his life is. Later when we get to chapter 5, but one of my favorite verses is in chapter 5 when he says in verse 20, here's this man described that he just acknowledges everything, his work, his toil, eating, drinking, everything is given him by the hand of God. And God shallots him. God empowers him to enjoy what he has. And look at the effect in verse 20 of chapter 5. He says, for he will not often consider the years of his life, because God keeps him occupied with the gladness of his heart. He is so enjoying the gift that God has given him of his life. It doesn't make any difference how long it is to him. So he's not all concerned about, am I going to die? How long am I going to live? I want to live a long time. He doesn't think that way, because life is so full. Every day is such a joy that instead of leaving him craving for more, he's content with every day. And when that day ends on this earth, he's fine with it, because he's occupied his days are occupied with the gladness of his heart. So here it's interesting in this poem. You've got 28 times he'll repeat this word, a time. There's a time for planting, a time to uproot. In other words, things change. There's times that you plant. It's fascinating because Holly took me over to the gardener, and we got some gardenias, is that right? And she's planting flowers. At the same time, she gets a note or an email from her sister and brother-in-law in Marcus, Iowa, showing the first layer of snow in their backyard. So we're planting flowers, and they're getting ready to freeze. And yet, there's a good time to plant. Right now, this is a good time to plant. But then there's a time to pull up the plants, just like her sister and brother-in-law had to do. There's seasons. Things change. Don't expect things are always going to be the exact same. That's not the plan. Then he says in verse 3, there's a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build. Here's a little observation for our poetry buffs. If you're really into poetry, this is called a chiasm. In poetry, a chiasm, from the word chi, which is the Greek word for X. It's an X. It's a CH, but it's an X in the Greek. And what you've got here is a flip over. So what happens here is in verse 2, you have a good thing and a bad thing. A good thing and a bad thing. Here in verse 3, he flips it, and now you've got a bad thing and a good thing, and a bad thing and a good thing. And it's just, again, Hebrew poetry. And that's why he starts sometimes a good thing and a bad thing, good thing, bad thing. Now verse 3, it's a bad thing to a good thing, and a bad thing to a good thing. It's just poetic expression. And notice he says here, there's a time to kill. Wait a second. That's a bit controversial. I mean, Exodus 20 says in the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not, what? Ratach is the Hebrew word. Thou shalt not murder. Killing's wrong. Murder's wrong. We're introduced to that in Genesis chapter 9, the first 7 verses. Right after the flood, and then God permitted mankind to eat meat. Apparently there had been a change before that. Everybody vegetarians, all right? You just ate plants. But after the flood, there was some change in the environment that apparently protein needed to come to the human body through meat. But God knew the moment that mankind would begin to kill animals, what would be the next step? Killing human beings. So he immediately in chapter 9 says, let me give you a warning. I've created mankind to bear my image. And if somebody destroys, an animal or a human being, destroys someone who bears the image of God, they will forfeit their life. It's capital punishment. I mean, it's just right there in Genesis chapter 9. That's why, to protect the preciousness of the image of God born by every human being, is to protect the preciousness of life. And the other way you make sure people celebrate the preciousness of life is that they realize they forfeit the most precious thing to them if they take a life. So what does he mean here when he says there's a time to kill? Well, it's interesting. If you go to Exodus and you go and find the Ten Commandments, you find this in Exodus chapter 20. And that's where you have the clear statement. In verse 13, thou shalt not murder. But now go to the next chapter. That's chapter 20 of Exodus. Now we go to chapter 21. Next chapter, verse 12. He who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. So this is where those in authority are to put to death somebody who had killed somebody and destroyed the image of God. Verse 14. If, however, a man acts presumptuously towards his neighbor so as to kill him craftily, you are to take him even from my altar that he may die. I like this next one. Verse 15. He who strikes his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. Wouldn't that be a good one to have? Well, maybe not. Now, here's the confusion. I thought I just read, thou shalt not murder. And in the next chapter, he gives you 3 occasions where somebody will be put to death. First of all, different Hebrew word. The word ratach, murder, is when I basically play God and destroy you because of my will. Where in chapter 21 is talking about basically someone put to death. That's why Romans 13, the Apostle Paul says that we are to submit to the government because the government does not bear the sword in vain. Makaira is the word sword, which was used for execution. And so the whole thing is that there is a time that people's behavior, they may need to forfeit their life for some atrocity or murder or something that they have done. So there are times to kill. Well, we say, but didn't Jesus reverse that? I mean, in Matthew chapter 5, remember when he's talking there in the Sermon on the Mount? And he says, you've heard this, but I say this. You've heard this, but I say this. Well, one part he says, you've heard this, but I tell you, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. So you've heard an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you that you're to forgive your enemies. Love your enemies. So it apparently looks like Jesus reversed this thing. Well, not really. Because if you go back to where he's quoting here in Exodus 21, he's talking about here in verse 22, two men are fighting. And one man's wife's pregnant. And as they fight, the other guy strikes the woman. And the child dies. She miscarriages. Well, the guy needs to pay a certain amount of money. And it says, verse 23, but if there's any further injury to the woman, so not only does she lose the child, but that she dies. So he hits her in such a way, she dies. Or she loses an eye. Or she loses a tooth. Or she's thrown into fire and she's burned. Here's what it says. But if there's any further injury, then you shall appoint as a penalty life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. Now, what's interesting, this is what Jesus is quoting. Well, when Jesus gives the list, he says, you've heard an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, he skips the first one on the list. What's the first one on the list? Life for life. He never reverses life for life. But he does reverse eye for eye, tooth for tooth, burn for burn, hand for hand, so forth. And so there's no evidence at all that Jesus ever reverses any of this. So he's just talking raw truth. In the slice of life, there's going to be a time that some people need to be put to death. And then he says there are times to heal. There's times that people are sick and suffering that they need to be relieved in their suffering. There needs to be compassion. Then he says there's a time to tear down and a time to build up. This idea of tearing down, building up deals with rocks and buildings. There's times to build things. Then there's times to tear those things down. I pastored Chiasm Bible Church for 25 years. When we got there, we're just 31, and 1981, February of. And we had the Sanctinasium, which was a gymnasium, and then another little building for children. And the rest was just dirt. Almost 20 acres of dirt. And then God just began to bless, and the church began to grow. The whole area was growing, but the church began to grow. And I'll never forget the first real building that we built was $700,000, two-story building for children. And it was easy to raise the money because our children were meeting for Sunday school in the broom closets. And so all we had to do is take pictures of our kids gathering together in the broom closets for Sunday school, and we raised the $700,000 and built this beautiful two-story building. And then as the church continued to grow, we built a little bridge, and we built another two-story building. Well, after I had completed and became pastor emeritus, which basically means, what do you do with the old man? He's still breathing, but he has no influence. And I'll never forget the day they tore down that second two-story building. I remember sitting there in the other building in the conference room watching, thinking of the people who had mortgaged their homes to get money to give towards that building, people who have given sacrificially, and I just seen this thing torn down, put in the back of dump trucks, and drive away. It's like the 7 last words of the church. You know what they are, don't you? We never did it that way before. We just have a hard time moving over and letting the new thing happen that needs to happen. There's a time to tear down, even though it's painful, but there's time then to build up. And there are those times that we need to move over. Then he says, verse 4, there's a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. This is why Paul says in Romans 12, there are times that we rejoice with each other, and there's times that we weep with each other. When we cry, we need to cry. And I know we guys are trained that we're not supposed to cry because that communicates a weakness, but that's a real serious deception. I'll tell you why. When something bad happens, grieving happens, painful happens, you have three choices. You can repress it. That's what we guys tend to do. Just repress it, pretend that you have no feelings about it. Or you go the other way and express it and bust some chops. Get mad, throw a tantrum, leave the church, whatever it might be. Punish whoever's causing you the pain. The third option is to stay on the hurt line. Stay on the hurt line and mourn. Be sad. Be sorrowful. Weep. You know, God has designed all of the emotions for a purpose. If we didn't have emotions, we'd just be a blob that has a few reflexes here and there. For example, the emotion of anger is the strongest of all our emotions. Our eyes dilate, blood flows through the muscles, we're ready to go. But the emotion of anger, that's why in Ephesians 4, he has an indicative. Be angry, but don't sin. Because the emotion of anger is an emotion. The word emotion is from the Latin word e, which means out, and motio, move, to move out. The emotions cause us to move out and do something, not just sit there. It's to lift it and shift it. And anger is basically to move, is to correct. When we see something that's unjust, something that is wrong. What's the difference between righteous anger and unrighteous anger? Did God ever get angry? Hello, read the Old Testament. Did Jesus ever get angry? Well, let me put it this way. Was he in a good mood when he made that whip and cleared out the temple? In Mark, he goes on into a room in a synagogue on the Sabbath, and there's a poor guy in agony because of his withered hand, and all the Jewish leaders sitting there going, is he going to heal him on the Sabbath? It says Jesus looked at them with anger. So apparently there is a righteous anger, but there's also an unrighteous anger. Be angry, but do not sin. Well, it's simple. It's not that complicated. If I get angry because I see some injustice to you, I see something painful, some assault, some horrible thing happening to you, and I am moved to say something, do something, stop it in some way, that's righteous anger. But if I get angry because something painful is being done to me, and I am the victim, and now I go after you, that's unrighteous anger. Because vengeance is mine, thus saith the Lord, Romans chapter 12, last paragraph. There's a point where, God will bring what's right, if, whatever you do to me. But anger, righteous anger, and that's what it means, be angry, but do not sin. Make it not about you, but make it. Well, the other emotions, like affection, when you have an affection for somebody, it moves you to want to serve. If you have the affection of fear, it moves you to fight or flight, as you've heard many times. But sorrow, weeping, crying is an emotion. And is an emotion that moves us to reflect on what's causing us to be so sad. Because it's only at those moments 2 Corinthians 1 kicks in when it says, and the God of comfort will comfort you. Why? So you can turn around and comfort others with the comfort by which you have been comforted by. In other words, why do we weep and need to weep and stay in the weeping? That's where we learn compassion. People who repress and never permit themselves to feel pain, they will never be compassionate because they'll never understand somebody else's suffering. Thus, there'll be nothing to ever move them to want to try to help and relieve that suffering. And that, therefore, there's a time to weep. There's a time to be sad. And when you're sad and life is kind of a bummer for a season, don't get medicated. You don't even have to get counseling, really. And don't get angry and bitter. Think, this is how my whole life. There's times Holly asked her, how are you doing? I said, well, I'm sad. Right now, I'm just going through a little bit of sadness. And she does the same thing too. And that is part of the slice of life. They said there's a time to laugh. There's a point. Sometimes we try to be too cool. I don't laugh. I'm mature. Come on. I'm tired of being called quirky for no other reason than I laugh. I laugh at myself. I think I'm a hoot. I mean, the things that I do, things I think, some of the stupid things I say, nobody's funnier than I am to me. Proverbs 17:22 says, a joyful heart is good medicine, but a broken spirit dries up the bones. So when you get the little bit of the slice and you get a chance to laugh, rejoice with those who rejoice. Laugh. Good old belly laugh. Let yourself rejoice and enjoy. Then verse 5, he says, there's a time to throw stones. Whoa, by the way, don't skip. There's a time to mourn and a time to dance. Boy, you can tell no Baptist wrote this. Verse 5, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to shun embracing. Now, the throwing stones and then gathering stones, there's a couple views of this, and we're not sure which one is right. So I'll give you all four. That way I know I'm giving you the right one, because it's in the four somewhere. In times of war, fields would be rendered useless if captured by throwing stones on those fields. So if you've got a field of corn, a field of wheat, you want to really punish your enemy, throw a bunch of rocks, lots of stones, so they can't cultivate their own. But then there's a time to build the stones. What they would do is if you had one of these, you would take the stones, you'd build terraces. Have you ever been to Palestine? They'll take these rocks and they will build terraces, and they'll have these terraces that will catch the rain, catch the water. It is a desert. And so there's a time to throw the rocks and defeat your enemy. Then there's a time to build rocks. Another view is shepherds would keep stones in their pouches to know how many sheep they had. So sometimes you're going to have a lot of sheep, and there's other times you're going to get rid of the stones because those sheep have been sold or taken away. Merchants would do the same thing with stones. They would record their commercial transactions. And then last of all, I don't know if it's Freudian or whatever, but it has sexual relations. This is about, there's time to have children and there's a time not to have children. In other words, sow your seed, not sow your seed. And he said there's a time to embrace and a time to shun embracing. There's a time to show affection. But there's also a time to shun embracing. Apparently, peace at all costs is not always really, really wise. Why would that be part of the slice of life? Where do people learn consequences? If wisdom is putting the dots together, if wisdom is knowing that these kind of decisions will produce these consequences, this kind of behavior will result with these kinds of results. To make those connections, connect the dots, that's called wisdom. Where do you learn that? It doesn't come innately. Innately, we just basically are born fools, and we would remain foolish because we would never make the connections. Someone's got to teach us the connections. And at that point, we sometimes bellyache about the next generation because we have these parents who decided they were not going to teach their kids consequences to their actions, consequences to their decisions. And so these kids got to learn their consequences by nature and on their own, and therefore we see them suffering a lot. And so there's a time that I do celebrate, show affection, but there's times that when someone acts foolishly, we shun that embracing. There are consequences to actions. And some embrace the consequences to their actions. Even the Apostle Paul in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 says, hey, he who doesn't work should not eat. He goes on to say, one who rebels against these commands, he says, mark that one and have no fellowship with him, but do not treat him as an enemy, but admonish him as a brother. You go, Paul, what are we talking about here? He says, no koinonia. It's not like, well, I know you left your wife, I know you stole its money, I know you've lied to the church, I know you da-da-da, but let's bygone be bygones, let's just No. Do not have fellowship. But do not treat him as an enemy, because he's still family, but admonish him. That word admonish is two little Greek words. Noeo, the mind, and tithemi, the place. Every time you're together, you're reminding them of their sin. Now, there's a point where they'll stop wanting to meet with you. That way you are not the rejector, but the rejectee, and that's what you want to go for. But then there's other times that they're wise. Proverbs 9 says, you rebuke a fool, they'll get angry at you. Rebuke a wise man, and they'll become wiser still and love you for it. And so there's a time. There's a time for people experience the consequences of their actions. And in verse 6, he says, a time to search and a time to give up is lost. A time to keep and a time to throw away. There are times for hard decisions. Holly and I are trying to think through purging. Because over the years, we've collected a whole lot of things. And as we moved from one larger house now to a townhouse, we got rid of a lot of things that were just stuff. Now we're down to the stuff that has meaning to us. But the hard decision is this stuff that has meaning to us has no meaning to our kids. So we know the kids will put it in goodwill and it will be gone. So we're trying to decide what stuff that we could give now to someone else that might have some meaning to them. Those are hard choices. And the question really is, take a good look at your garage. You're going to find out, there's times you got to make those hard choices. Holly and I are thinking about the possibility of there's this retirement village called Westminster. And the average age is about 80 years old. Well, we're 71. And yet we're really praying and thinking about does God have another church for us? And we moved in there, those dear folks, if anybody needs a sense of hope, sense of encouragement, maybe a live-in chaplain, a live-in pastor. So we're playing with that. The thing that's frightening is for us to move into there, it's half the size, it's smaller, half the size of our townhouse, which means what? A lot more hard decisions on what do we purge and what do we give away and what do we take with us. It's part of life, he says. And in verse 7, he says, a time to tear apart and a time to sew together, a time to be silent and a time to speak. In this particular culture, when you lost somebody to death, a child, a spouse, a loved one, you would grieve. In that culture, you would take dirt and you would throw it over your head as a sign that you were grieving. You'd also take your clothing and you would tear your clothing as a sign of your grieving. So there's going to be a time in the slice of your life, there'll be pieces of the puzzle which are painful. They're grieving times. But then there's going to be a time that you need to what? You need to sew together. You need to sew your clothes back together and move on. And move on. There's a time to be silent and a time to speak. Rabbi Ben Sira distinguished two kinds of silence from this passage. He said, quote, there is one who keeps silent because he has no answer, while another keeps silent because he knows when to speak. When I mentioned the three friends of Job, what kind of thoughts do you get? Yeah, those rats. Oh, I'm glad I don't have friends like them. They just made his life miserable. Kept giving him bad counsel, accusing him. Wait a second. When Moses first started losing everything, he lost his children, he lost his wealth, he lost his estate, he lost his health. Satan had his hand on Job. Satan apparently decided to leave his wife with Job because she was quite a blessing. Curse God and die. So apparently Satan thought, let's keep her right into there. She's really adding to his boils. But anyway, no offense to the women. This is just the Bible I'm giving you here. You deal with it. But then it says that his friends come from afar. And they come from afar and they see him in the distance and they can hardly recognize him. And they start grieving. They throw dust over their hair and they tear their clothes. Then he gets close. And then they sit around him. And for 7 days, they don't say a word. How many friends do you have that would come and just sit with you for 7 days and not say a word. I think the three friends get a bad rap. Because they only get in trouble the moment they start what? Talking. See, when you're silent, and sometimes you kind of think, I don't know what to say. I'm not going to go visit that person in the hospital or that person in their home because I don't know what to say. That's the point. If you don't know what to say nothing. Because in saying nothing, you give them two wonderful gifts. When a person's really hurting, a person's really, really in pain, they feel what I call deathness. Because the Greek word for death is Thonatos. Like the study of death is thonatology. And the essence of Thonatos is a sense of aloneness, isolation. And when somebody's really hurting physically or emotionally or in grief, they feel deathness. They feel absolutely isolated and alone. They feel like death because no one understands. Nobody really cares. I'm alone in this. And the way you can grab them and pull them right out of deafness is by giving them two gifts. First gift is the gift of presence. You're just there. Keep your mouth shut. You're just there. And right there they realize they are not alone. And you have no idea. Without even saying a word, but just with your presence, you're pulling them out of that feeling of isolation. Second gift you're giving them is the gift of understanding. Because when they feel nobody knows, nobody understands, and then some wingnut says, I know what you're going through. Don't ever do that. Because you don't. I've lost somebody. Yeah, but that's not what they're going through. And so by the fact, the word to honor is to weigh heavy. It's to listen and to weigh heavy somebody's feelings, thoughts, hurts, pain expressed. Without saying a word. Just listen. So by giving them the gift of presence and giving them the gift of understanding, by just listening, you pull them out of deafness. There's a time to speak and there's a time not to speak. And when you do speak, Ephesians chapter 4, verse 26-27, the Apostle Paul says, let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but that which is edifying, that it may give grace to the need of the moment. It doesn't say throw up on them and tell them the truth no matter what. No. What's good is the need of the moment, and what's going to give grace to build them up. So, gentlemen, what's the most frightening question you could ever be asked by your spouse? Does this dress make me look fat? Your answer: I didn't fall in love with the dress, sweetheart. I fell in love with you. Or if you're getting dressed and she says, does this dress make me look fat? You just ask her, does this face make me look stupid? Then he says, interesting, then there's a time to love and a time to hate. Now I understand about the time to love, but what's he talking about, this time to hate? We're Christians. We don't hate. I mean, I'll never hate. I love God. The love of God is the mark of my life. I don't hate. How do you feel about that cancer in your grandchild's life? How do you think Holly and I felt about those cancerous tumors in little Austin's brain? 2 weeks before his 7th birthday, they take his life. Abraham Lincoln first saw a human being sold on the slave blocks in New Orleans, and he felt such hatred rising in his heart, he resolved that if he ever had the chance to do something about it, he would. Oh yeah, we hate. So we don't hate people. Didn't say anything about people. But there are things you hate. You hate things that destroy people. And so as you would see somebody has cancer in their little child, of course they're going to hate the cancer. And there will be times in your slice of life, there'll be things in your life that will so hurt the people you love, you will hate those things. And then he says, And there's a time for war and time for peace. You know, some people kind of wonder, a time for war? Yeah, there will be times for war, and you'll have to take the responsibility for your part. I know for me, it was the Vietnam War. Yet at the same time, I wasn't going to kill. So I actually went and signed up to be I went and interviewed to be a chaplain in the Navy. But Holly had got herself pregnant, and we had little John, who's now 47. And when the recruiter said that I'd be gone from the family for 6 months at a time, I said, just once? He says, no, about once a year. I realized John needed a father more than the United States Navy needed me as a chaplain. But I always felt badly about that. So later on, I joined. I became a captain. I had a uniform and a hat. Did I not look good? I was a captain in the Arizona Air Force Auxiliary. And my job for 2 years was that when there were emergencies and people were hurt, I was to go to those homes and be a chaplain. And the 2 years I served, apparently there were no emergencies. So I don't really feel much like a captain, as far as that goes. But there's a time for war. And again, there's decisions. I've had to counsel many young men who've been in war. Do you go? There's many options of what you can do in war, but he says in slice of life, there's going to be war. It's a fallen world. And then he says in the course, there's going to be peace. So what he does is, this is a slice of life. These are all little pieces of puzzles in your life. And they don't necessarily connect to each other, but God connects them into a plan. Look at the plan explained in verse 9. He says, what profit is there to the worker from that in which he toils? That word profit, there's the word yatron. There's that word. What is left over? So with all these different events that seem senseless in your life, what is left over? What's the aftertaste of all these events that leaves you with something to choose to extract enjoyment? Verse 10, I have seen the task which God has given to sons of men, with which to occupy themselves. Now he says God has basically permitted all the stuff so that they would occupy us. That word is they would humble us. Humility is when you place yourself under something, trusting that God will use it for your good. The opposite is to raise your hand and a fist in the face of God and say, I don't understand why this happened. I don't like this. I don't like this peace. I don't like what's happening in my life. It feels like my life is going right south to the drain. And we lift our fists in the face of God. God, I hate you. I don't like this. You better change. Or I'm just going to punish you by not going to church. And I don't know how many Christians I've talked to that have gone that direction. That's the opposite of let these things occupy you. That is, humble you. Why? Read on. He has made everything appropriate in its time. All these pieces he's made appropriate. That particular word appropriate is a Hebrew word yafar. Yafah. And the Hebrew word yafah means beautiful. So literally he says, God makes all these little pieces beautiful, appropriate in its time. And the word yafah means that there's no fear of anything wrong with it. When you really think, what makes something beautiful? You don't have to be afraid that there's something wrong with it. So when you see a sunset, you see a painting, you see a wonderful story, a film, whatever it might be, and if you don't fear there's anything wrong with it, that's basically beautiful. And that's what this concept is all about. So right when I think my life's falling apart with all these horrible, toxic things happening to me, God makes all things beautiful. They're not going to be wrong because they were brought into your life or permitted to be brought in your life. But he says, here's what your problem is. He has also set eternity in their heart, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. This word eternity is the word olam. Olam is this, God has put olam, eternity, in our hearts. It is this deep desire to know the whole story. the beginning and the end. We're an inquisitive sort. You go to a movie, and it's a 2-hour movie. And I say, I tell you what, let's do something fun. Let's run in the middle of the movie. Let's watch it for 15 minutes and then leave and get popcorn. Do I have any takers? No, because you got olam in your heart. You want to know the beginning, the middle, and the end. You want to see the whole puzzle. And it bothers you when you cannot see how all the pieces fit together. When we go back to Iowa to visit Holly's family, there was a time there they'd always put together a big old jigsaw puzzle. 500 pieces, 1,000 pieces. And when they would lay it all out, I would always go up when they weren't looking, take 2 or 3 pieces and put it in my pocket. Now, in retrospect, that was not a nice thing to do. What a rat. I'm a sinner. Still am, but forgiven. But then, of course, towards the end of the week, when they were all frustrated and mad, I just kind of throw out the pieces there. You know, I whine about getting older. I don't like this getting older thing, but I will tell you this. There's one upside to it, is that all of a sudden I'm seeing more of the picture of all the puzzles fitting together, and there are things that did not make sense to me years ago that make an awful lot of sense to me now, because I'm beginning to see the picture. So he goes on, and he says, verse 12, I know that there is nothing better for them to rejoice, to do good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labor. It's the gift of God. He reminds us of what he said in the first 2 chapters. Remember, even these bits and pieces, when they don't seem to be gifts or expression of God's love or God's power, but trust his wisdom behind the plan, he says, know that everything God does will remain forever. There is nothing to add to it. There's nothing to take from it. For God has so worked that men should fear him. Interesting. God does all this stuff so that we fear him. This word fear is all over the text. As a matter of fact, you find it in chapter 5, verse 7, chapter 7, verse 18, chapter 8, verse 12 and 13. And look at how the whole journal ends. Second to the last verse. He says, okay, let me summarize. The conclusion, when all has been heard, is fear God and keep his commandments, because thus applies to every person. So this whole thing, God has all these pieces and puzzles just to make us afraid of him? No, 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 no. Don't confuse fear with being afraid of God. Fear. In Exodus 20:20, God basically gives Moses the 10 commandments. And he first, on Mount Sinai, there's an explosion of earthquake and fire and lightning, and the people are scared to death. And they say, Moses, you talk to us. Don't let God. And then you got this great verse in 2020 vision, Exodus 20:20. Read it yourself. And the Hebrew word for fear is yareh. So he says, fear not. Yareh, fear not, for I've done all these things so the fear of God rest upon you. Now, if you want to look for a contradiction, how about one verse? Right there. It's the same word. How do you understand that? Our eldest son, John, as I mentioned before, when he was just like, 6, 7 years old, we gave him swimming lessons. And so I paid my $25 and off to work, and that week he was at the pool, at the park, swimming lessons. At the end of the week, I wanted to know what I got for my $25. So we go there, and he's going to show me how he can now swim. We're at the deep end of the pool. I just want him to dive in from the one side to the other side, the deep end. Show me your stuff. Well, he looks at the water, he looks at me, he looks at the water, and he begins to shake. He gets to be frightened. And I'm saying, okay, come on, John, dive in. Dive in. And he looks at me, and he looks like there. And John, if you don't dive in, Daddy's coming around there, and I'm going to. And, of course, Holly's yelling at this ear, you're a horrible father. You're just a horrible father. You know, I said, I don't know, I'm not going to raise a girl. Yeah, so I was ready to move, and all of a sudden he looked, he saw that I was serious. He dove in. Swam across underwater all the way. Turned around, did it 3 more times. Big smile. You see, what happened was this. Sometimes it takes a greater fear to dispel a lesser fear. Apparently the fear of me was greater than the fear of drowning. But you see, God removes the terror because God loves. But when you have fear and you remove the terror, what is left is respect. And how is respect and reverence expressed? Obedience. Sometimes it's the only way God knows we will obey. If we know what he could do, but he won't, because he's our Heavenly Father, but what's left is this respect, which expresses obedience. And that's why he ends this whole thing by saying, again, fear God, keep his commandments. So I close with, what is it to keep his commandments? We talk about the commandments of Christ. And you kind of think, well, where do I find a list? There's no list. I close with this. You want to know how to keep the commandments, how to fear God, give reverence, and to keep the commandments of Christ. You just simply ask yourself a very simple question when these different events come into your life. What does love require of me? That's all you got to answer. So when something good happens, something bad happens. A slice of life slices into you and you bleed, but is one of these pieces of the puzzle that God's putting together will make all things beautiful and appropriate. And the older you get, you begin to see the picture form. But one day you'll see the completed picture when you're with Jesus Christ. But meanwhile, instead of putting a fist in God's face and becoming bitter and angry and punishing in some way, it's basically, okay, God, these things are to humble me. You I fear, and therefore I give reverence. And so what does love require of me? And I just do whatever it is that love requires of me in any of these situations. And I'll be participating with what God's doing to complete his plan. Does that make sense? If you're a little confused, we'll do this again at 6 o'clock.